a voice emerging from the darkness, and a man who never belonged to the spotlight. There are voices you only need to hear once in your life, and you will never forget them. No background music, no face appearing on screen, just a low, raspy, unhurried line, scraping through the air like stone against metal. And in that instant, your body tightens on its own, because the subconscious understands perfectly well. Danger has just entered the story. That is the sensation Michael Wincott has given audiences for decades. He was never an A-list star. Never a face splashed across magazine covers. Never a name Hollywood lovingly repeated at grand, glittering award ceremonies. But if you've ever seen The Crow, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, or more recently, Nope, then you have been afraid of him. Or at the very least, you felt uneasy the moment he appeared. And that is the strange thing. How could an actor with such a powerful, unmistakable presence, someone who can dominate the frame simply by standing still, exist on the margins of Hollywood for an entire career? Why would a man whose voice is considered a true cinematic weapon nearly vanish from the mainstream screen for years? No scandal, no noise, no explanation, and most importantly, was Michael Wincott a talent abandoned by Hollywood, or a man who deliberately turned his back on the very thing so many others desperately crave? The story of Michael Wincott is not the familiar tale of from poverty to fame, or overcoming adversity to become a legend. This is a different story, quieter, colder, harder to swallow. It is the story of a man who refused to bend himself to fit the Hollywood mold. An artist who knew exactly who he was, and knew just as clearly who he never wanted to become. Behind that voice, there is not only technique, not only natural talent, but an inner world forged by silence, solitude, and choices that allowed no compromise. And to understand why Michael Wincott became the man he is, we must go back to before he possessed that voice of darkness. Back to where everything began. A place without spotlights, without stages. Only a boy learning how to observe the world from the edges. And from those edges, one of Hollywood's most unforgettable shadows was born. Before there was a voice capable of unsettling people with just a few whispered words, before Hollywood labeled it the voice made for villains, Michael Wincott was simply a boy growing up in Scarborough, on the outskirts of Toronto, a place without glamour, without cinematic magic, and certainly without anyone teaching you how to be special. Scarborough in the 1960s and 70s was not the kind of place where stars were born. It was gray, cold, disciplined, closed in, winters dragged on, streets lay quiet. People learned endurance more than expression. Wincott's family belonged to the immigrant working class, carrying two cultural lineages, English and Italian. There was no abundance, no indulgence, and almost no concept of pursuing artistic dreams, the way it is often romanticized. In an environment like that, children usually face two choices: either be loud to be noticed or remain silent and observe in order to survive. Michael Wincott chose the second path. He was not a talkative child, not the type to claim the spotlight in class, but he was the kind who remembered for a very long time other people's eyes, voices, and gestures. And this is the crucial point. Those who grow up in silence often develop a rare ability. They sense the atmosphere before a word is ever spoken. That explains why, later on, Wincott could stand still, act without excess, speak very little, and yet audiences still felt that something was wrong the moment he appeared. Michael Wincott's low, raspy voice was never a gimmick. It was not engineered to impress. It was the natural outcome of someone accustomed to keeping emotions inside, speaking slowly, speaking sparingly, but making every word carry weight. That childhood also taught him something essential. The world does not automatically grant you a place. You must understand where you stand. Because of this, when Wincott came to acting, he did not carry the mindset of someone seeking to be liked. He did not enter the profession dreaming of stardom. He entered with a far more dangerous question. What kind of person am I? And how far can I go without betraying myself? His decision to study acting and later to be accepted into Juilliard was not an attempt to escape his past. On the contrary, it was a way to sharpen the darkness he had carried since childhood. Juilliard does not teach you how to become famous. Juilliard teaches you how to confront yourself, to peel back layers of emotion, fear, and repression. And for Michael Wincott, this was nothing new. He had been doing it his entire life. If most actors learn how to perform after they grow up, Wincott had lived in a state of character from an early age, observing, keeping distance, never rushing to reveal himself. That background created a man Hollywood would later find difficult to categorize, not friendly enough to be a mainstream hero, not loud enough to become an entertainment star, yet too real, too deep, too unsettling to ever be just a forgettable supporting role. And from that psychological foundation, when Michael Wincott stepped into acting, he did not seek the spotlight. He sought a place in the shadows, where he understood best who he was, and from there, his unusual journey truly began. While most actors step into the profession with a very clear dream, to be seen, to be remembered, to become famous, Michael Wincott began in the opposite direction. He did not enter acting to become someone in the public eye. He entered acting as a way to dig deeper into the human being. What a person says when afraid, how silence behaves when anger sets in, and how the eyes change the moment someone decides to betray themselves. For Wincott, acting was like a form of dissection, not to display technique, but to strip truth bare. After years of serious and demanding training, he stepped into the artistic world with what seemed like an absolute advantage, a rigorous foundation. But real life does not operate on the logic of study well, and you will be rewarded. Out there, what decides whether you get a role or not is often compressed into just a few seconds, the moment someone watches you walk into the room. And in that very second, Michael Wincott encountered his problem. He did not have the bright, star-friendly face. He did not carry the warm, approachable energy that makes people want to rush in for a hug. There was something cold about him, a natural distance, as if he were always standing half a step away from the crowd. Then he spoke, low, raspy, unhurried, waited. Many people would try to fix that, try to soften the voice, try to smile more, try to turn themselves into a more digestible version. But Wincott chose the most dangerous path of all. He stopped asking permission to exist. He accepted that he was not born to make audiences feel safe. When you are the kind of person who can change the atmosphere simply by standing still, you will always be confronted with an unspoken question. Who are you in this story? And for Michael Wincott, the answer became clear earlier than for most. He belonged to the dark. Not because he loved evil, but because he understood that the darker corners of human nature are often truer, more alive, and far harder to fake. His early roles, therefore, did not need to be large, but they were right. He appeared as a stranger in the corner of a room, a man who spoke little, but looked as though he already knew too much. He did not need long lines. A single sentence was enough to make the audience feel that something was beginning to crack. The strange thing was this. After the film ended, people might not remember the character's name, but they remembered the feeling. They remembered the voice. They remembered the way he made an ordinary scene suddenly feel dangerous. And that was when doors began to open, in a very Hollywood way. Not the kind of, "we have a new star," but the kind of, "call him. He gives this scene weight." At the same time, however, a trap was forming. When you become the seasoning that intensifies a story, the system will want you to repeat that exact formula forever. They will look at you and see only a function: villain, assassin, mastermind, mysterious man. They will want that voice, those eyes, that silence, but they may not want to know the real person behind them. Michael Wincott understood this sooner than most people realize, because he did not rush. He did not chase every opportunity just to be seen. He chose carefully. He moved slowly, and he kept a deliberate distance from the addiction known as the spotlight. He was building a career not on the ambition to become the center of attention, but on something far more durable: identity. And then, when the time came, when Hollywood needed villains sharp enough to stand opposite its heroes, Michael Wincott possessed something very few others did: a presence that people believed in from the very first second. Only, when that voice began to be remembered, everything started to change. Michael Wincott was no longer just an actor passing through the frame. Each time he appeared, the atmosphere automatically grew heavier. Audiences began to anticipate danger. Cinema started to bind him to darkness. And from that moment on, he was no longer seen as a choice, but as a figure. A figure powerful enough to create aura and heavy enough to begin exerting pressure. Once cinema begins to recognize a face, a voice, a familiar sensation, it does something entirely natural. It holds tightly onto that feeling. With Michael Wincott, that is exactly how things unfolded. The moment arrived quietly but unmistakably. He did not need a leading role to break through. He only needed to stand in the right place within the story and let presence speak for itself. The early 1990s were a time when Hollywood had a particular hunger for distinctive villains. Gone were the days of loud, theatrical evil. Audiences were becoming drawn to threats that were cold, still, and unpredictable. And into that space, Michael Wincott stepped. In Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, he was not the center of the story. Yet every time Guy of Gisborne entered the frame, one thing was immediately clear. This was a man who did not need to prove how dangerous he was. The eyes, the posture, the voice, everything carried a terrifying sense of control. Not the kind of villain who demands attention, but the kind who makes you afraid to look away. Then came the Crow. Top Dollar was not a loud crime lord. He spoke slowly. He smiled sparingly. Yet he made the entire world around him move to his rhythm. Michael Wincott did not play villains in the traditional sense. He gave them weight, like a stone placed in the center of a room, unmoving, yet impossible to ignore. This was when the aura was formed, not through screen time, not through a dominant storyline, but through aftertaste. Long after the scene ended, audiences still carried a sense of unease with them, and cinema remembered exactly where that feeling came from. The mechanism behind Michael Wincott's aura was different from that of most stars. It was not built on empathy, it was built on vigilance. Each of his appearances felt like a warning. This story is not safe. And once audiences grew accustomed to feeling that way whenever he appeared, the image began to solidify. In Strange Days, he became Philo Gant. polished, courteous, yet rotten at the core. Here, Michael Wincott revealed what truly set him apart. He did not turn villains into monsters. He turned them into human beings real enough to make us uncomfortable. And that is the most haunting kind of villain. Hollywood loved this. But Hollywood also did what it always does. It repeated the formula. When an image proves effective, the system wants more of it, and in safer variations. That voice, that gaze, that silence, the same sensation, repeated across different films. And from here, pressure began to take shape. Michael Wincott's aura was not a bright light shining directly upon him. It was more like a halo behind his back, enough to separate him from the crowd, but also enough to lock him into a fixed position. Each new role was no longer seen as an experiment, but as a promise. He would bring darkness. In Alien, Resurrection, the setting changed. The genre changed. But the expectation remained. Audiences waited for the familiar feeling. So did the industry. And when an actor is loved for delivering a specific sensation, the line between identity and trap becomes dangerously thin. At this point, Michael Wincott had reached his own kind of peak. He was trusted, remembered, called upon when they needed that exact kind of man. But deep inside, the old question returned. No longer small, but clear and heavy. Was this recognition, or was it confinement? When an aura is built from darkness, it does not only illuminate a career, it also begins to cast a shadow over the person standing inside it. When an image is repeated long enough, outsiders call it a brand. But for the person standing inside it, it begins to feel like a loop. For Michael Wincott, the storm did not arrive through scandal or a loud collapse. It arrived far more quietly, through everything that was left unsaid. He began to realize that every new script placed on the table carried the same expectation. There was no need to read it all. After just a few pages, he already knew where he was meant to stand, how he was meant to speak, and what feeling he was expected to deliver to the audience. No one said it outright, but everyone understood the unspoken rule. Give us exactly what we're used to. That is the most dangerous kind of pressure. No one forces you, no one gives orders. But you know very clearly, if you change, you become difficult to use. Michael Wincott was not someone who failed to understand the rules of the game. He understood perfectly how the system worked. But the problem lay elsewhere. He did not want to become a copy of himself. The villain roles he had played all possessed depth, but when placed side by side, they began to blur together. The same silences, the same cadence of speech, the same gaze that made others hesitate. What had once been identity now stood on the verge of becoming formula. And for someone who had always seen acting as a way to explore the human being, that felt like being forced to stand still. The pain here was not about fewer roles or less recognition. It was the feeling of no longer being asked where he wanted to go. When you are loved for a very narrow slice of who you are, the rest of you slowly fades from view, even in your own eyes. There is a great paradox in Michael Wincott's career. The more successful he became, the narrower his space to breathe. He was not someone who enjoyed appearing in public. He did not enjoy interviews. He did not enjoy explaining himself to crowds. And in a world that increasingly demands artists not only perform well, but also sell a personal image, his silence began to turn into a disadvantage. This tension did not explode. It accumulated, role after role, casting call after casting call. Each time he realized he was being remembered for a feeling, not for a person. Eventually, the question was no longer, is this role good? It became, if I keep accepting roles like this, who am I still allowed to be? That was the moment Michael Wincott began to step back. Not because he was growing weaker, but because he refused to lose the most important thing to him, the right to be himself in his acting. That silent storm did not knock him down, but it forced him to face an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, stepping away from the spotlight is the only way to preserve who you are. There was no press conference, no formal announcement of retirement, no scandal for the media to cling to. Michael Wincott simply was no longer there. To the public, that absence looked like a familiar Hollywood pattern, an actor who had fallen out of favor, replaced by newer faces, swept aside by the current of the market. But to those who looked more closely, what was happening was not abandonment. It was a deliberate withdrawal. At a point when his career was stable enough to continue on momentum alone, Wincott chose to stop. Not because invitations had dried up, but because those invitations no longer asked him any questions. They only repeated old answers. He did not disappear from life. He disappeared from the familiar vortex. In a system where actors are valued by how easily they can be used, refusing to repeat yourself is a dangerous act. It makes you unpredictable. And in Hollywood, unpredictability equals risk. Michael Wincott understood this. He also understood that if he kept appearing merely to meet expectations, he would lose the very thing that had brought him here in the first place: honesty in his acting. His silence confused many people. No one knew exactly what he was doing, how he was living, or whether he ever intended to return. And that ambiguity gave rise to predictable stories, that he had declined, that he was no longer being chosen. But the truth was often simpler and harder to accept. He did not want to continue down that road. Not everyone is calm enough to walk away from the thing they do best. Not everyone dares to accept temporary obscurity just to avoid betraying themselves. Michael Wincott did not disappear because of failure. He disappeared because he understood that if he continued, the price would be his own identity. And when the lights no longer shone directly on that face, the real question began to surface. Not for Hollywood, but for himself. If no one is waiting for me anymore in that familiar darkness, where do I still want to stand? The silence that followed that question was not emptiness. It was the necessary space for a man to find himself again. When the spotlight no longer shines on you every day, the first thing that appears is not freedom, but emptiness. For Michael Wincott, the years after stepping away from the familiar rhythm were neither loud nor dramatic. There was no spectacular fall, only a prolonged silence, a space in which he was forced to live with a question that a packed work schedule had once allowed him to postpone. Who am I when no one is waiting for a specific image from me anymore? Life in the shadows does not mean hiding. It is a different tempo of living. Less appearance, less explanation, less being stared at. For someone long identified by a voice and a silhouette, no longer being constantly called by name was both relieving and unsettling. A career was no longer a straight line forward. It became a series of small, slow, private turns. In this phase, Michael Wincott chose work that did not demand he carry his old image with him. The stage, voice, acting. Projects where value lay in the process, not in media exposure. There, he did not need to be what was expected. He only needed to be real. And it was precisely when the lights receded that his private life revealed itself in a very particular way. Through the absence of information. Michael Wincott has never spoken publicly about marriage or family in the familiar sense. No wedding photos, no love story revisited in interviews, no one standing beside him in front of the camera as a partner. That silence was not avoidance, but a consistent choice, keeping the relationships that mattered in a place that did not require an audience. After years of being seen as an image, he likely understood the value of spaces untouched by scrutiny, connections that did not need validation, evenings that did not need to be retold. In that world, he was not the villain, not the voice of darkness, just a human being living fully within his own rhythm. The years in the shadows did not heal in spectacular ways. They dulled sharp edges, slowed the breath, allowed a person to stop proving. And for Michael Wincott, maturity in this period did not lie in returning faster, but in not rushing to return at all. When no one was asking him anymore to deliver danger, he finally had time to listen to what he truly needed. Not bigger roles, not a more central position, but a way of working that did not force him to trade privacy and identity. Those years left scars, but they also left something precious. The right to choose, the choice to appear or not, the choice to speak or remain silent, the choice to keep personal life in a safe place rather than placing it under the lights. And from that foundation of silence, any return, if it comes, will no longer be a race against expectation. It will be the decision of someone who has learned how to live outside the glow of fame without losing himself. Michael Wincott's return did not begin with an announcement. There was no comeback campaign, no redemption narrative, no hunger to reclaim a former position. He simply reappeared when he was ready. After many years living outside the relentless pace of production, Wincott returned with a completely different posture. There was no longer a need to prove who he was, no need to shatter an old image. He stepped back into the frame with the calm of someone who had accepted the entirety of his path. Both what was remembered and what had been left behind. When he appeared in Nope, it was not a showy role. Antler's Holst was a quiet, contained figure haunted by images and the price of pursuing them. No excessive dialogue, no extended explanations, just a few moments of stillness, enough for audiences to recognize Michael Wincott had returned, but not to please anyone. The most noticeable change lay not in the role itself, but in the energy. He no longer carried the feeling of being pushed into a fixed position, no longer bore the expectation of make this scene darker. If darkness appeared, it was because the character required it, not because an old image demanded it. At this stage, Wincott was no longer chasing a career in the conventional sense. He became selective. He moved slowly. He accepted only projects that allowed him to remain within silence without being forced to become the version others had grown accustomed to. And there was another possibility, just as quiet. For Michael Wincott, whether to return or not was no longer a matter of survival. He had built a life in which acting was a part of his existence, not the entirety of his identity. If there were more roles, that was a choice. If not, he was still whole. This rebirth did not resemble an upward curve. It looked more like a calm surface after the waves had settled. Every movement was deliberate. Every appearance had a reason. Michael Wincott did not return to reclaim glory. He returned because glory no longer defined who he was. And precisely for that reason, every appearance he makes afterward, however rare, carries a different kind of weight. Not the weight of ambition, but that of a man who chose to live truthfully with himself first, and only then chose to stand before the camera. Michael Wincott's legacy is not measured by rows of gleaming trophies or grand award ceremonies broadcast on live television. In fact, he does not possess a large collection of accolades by Hollywood standards. And paradoxically, that fact says a great deal about his true place in cinema. Michael Wincott was never the kind of face favored by awards campaigns. He rarely played leading roles, rarely stood at the center of a story, and even more rarely appeared in films designed specifically to chase awards. When recognition came, it usually arrived quietly, from fellow professionals, from longtime audiences, from people who understood cinema rather than red carpets. And it is precisely this absence that clarifies an essential truth. Michael Wincott's value lies not in being awarded, but in being irreplaceable. Some actors are remembered for the trophies they win. Michael Wincott is remembered for the feeling he leaves behind. Whenever he appears, the story darkens automatically. No urgent music, no extended dialogue. Just a low voice, a measured gaze, a composed stance, and the audience understands that from this point on, nothing is safe. His greatest legacy is the way he redefined the villain. Not flamboyant, not exaggerated, not turning evil into spectacle. He made villains human, calm, rational, inwardly complex. And because of that, they became far more frightening than any shouting monster. That influence requires no awards to validate it. It lives on in the way many actors who came after learned restraint, learned to use silence, learned to let a character simply be rather than force an impression. Michael Wincott became a quiet benchmark. Those who truly understand the craft recognize immediately what he brought to it. In an industry that celebrates what is visible, marketable, and easy to reward, Wincott's career offers a different reminder. There are actors who are not honored with medals, but are held in memory for a very long time. And in cinema, where most images pass by and disappear, being remembered in that way, steadily, quietly, without the need for confirmation, is the greatest reward an artist can leave behind. Michael Wincott's story does not end with an awards ceremony, nor does it close with a grand declaration. It comes to rest at a quieter point, where a man has gone far enough to understand that not every path needs to be illuminated. He did not become a star in the traditional sense, but he became a marker, a presence that makes cinema slow down, a voice that makes people listen before they even understand why. In a world that constantly urges artists to be more, faster, louder, Michael Wincott chose the opposite path. He spoke less, appeared less, explained less, and it is precisely that restraint that gives weight to every moment he steps into the frame. Perhaps the greatest lesson of this journey is not about whether one should pursue glory or reject it. It lies in a harder question. How much are you willing to trade in order to remain yourself? Because not everyone is brave enough to walk away from the thing they do exceptionally well. Not everyone accepts being forgotten for a time just to preserve their identity. And not everyone understands that sometimes the greatest success is not losing yourself along the way. If you have ever remembered a voice long after a film has ended, perhaps that is Michael Wincott's answer to cinema. And what about you? What do you think truly defines a legacy? Awards, fame, or the feeling that stays with the audience? If you had to choose, would you choose to be seen or to be yourself? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue exploring journeys that exist outside the spotlight, yet are anything but forgotten. Thank you goodbye, and see you in the next video.